Can you prove that Jesus ever existed? Well, that depends on what version of Jesus you mean. The magical man god that did miracles? Well, of course not, because that's complete nonsense. But can you prove that a real person named Jesus, or more accurately, Yeshua ben Joseph, ever existed? And the answer to that is still no. But let's go watch someone try anyhow. Here's one for you. I found this tiny little channel that purports to being able to prove Jesus, but they can't. They just can't. And that's hardly a surprise, is it? We've seen lots of theists claiming to be able to prove all kinds of things, and they get nowhere remotely close. Because they can't, and they don't care. They only want to believe, and believe blindly. And I suspect this is going to turn out to be the exact same thing. So let's go take a look, shall we?
Part 1 of proving Jesus existed.
Alright, why does this look like it's formatted for your phone? And why does it sound like this person is on a caffeine high? Anyway, let's step back and take a look at this. This is a pretty long series of videos by a channel called Gospel for All, Never Sin Again. I figured, hey, here's a bunch of crazy ideas, because there are always a bunch of crazy ideas if you notice, to debunk all in one place. Now, I don't know if I'm going to do all of these, because at the time that I'm writing this, I haven't even seen this one. So we're going to have to see, but so far, color me not impressed. The production values seem very, very low, which granted, I don't necessarily care about, because for me, it's the message that matters, not the flashy graphics. But the voice running at warp speed, that might be a problem. But anyhow, history. We can go talk about history. We need to understand that history, especially ancient history, most of that is just a guess. It might be based on a lot of data, or sometimes very little, but all we can do is estimate what might have happened based on the accounts that we have from the time. And of course, we have to assume the fidelity of those accounts. We have to assume that the people who wrote those accounts, they were telling the truth, or at least what they saw of it. Not just as they saw it, or as they believed it, but as it actually happened. And that's not always the case. It's why historians rely on multiple, independent accounts from multiple independent eyewitnesses. The less of that you have, the less reliable your ideas about history tend to be. But let's let Speedy Gonzalez here keep going, and we'll explore this more.
So before we actually start off with facts and evidence, we have to get one thing clear. To prove Jesus existed, we need to look at historical facts, dates, and people. So basically, we need to use history to prove that Jesus was a real person. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because many uneducated skeptics will immediately say that you cannot trust certain documents or certain events because they happened such a long time ago.
Nobody ever says that. I see a lot of theists who make this claim, but I have never, ever run into anyone who has doubted a source simply because of its age. Ever. And the reason I think a lot of theists make this unsubstantiated claim is because they don't like the real reason that people doubt the veracity of the Bible, because it simply doesn't hold water as a historical document. Now, this might be jumping the gun, so I'll just skim a bit, but we know that the authors of the four Gospels were not eyewitnesses to the story of Jesus. They were written anonymously, and there are serious textual problems with them being written by the people claimed to have written them. Immediately, that raises questions with the historicity of the Bible, because you're not talking about people who demonstrably saw the events in question. As I said, historians require multiple, independent eyewitnesses so they can go back and verify the same details appear in multiple accounts. That makes it more likely that it actually happened than if you just have a bunch of different stories that say a bunch of different things. And the Bible doesn't provide that. There are multiple clear contradictions between accounts, whether the religious happen to like that or not. which shows that these are likely just mythic retellings, only written down years and often decades after the fact. These are stories that followers told, and in the retelling, the details got corrupted. But anyway, let's get back to the video and see where else he goes.
Well, guess what? That's what history is, the records of things that happened a long time ago.
Not quite. The goal of history is to form as accurate a picture as possible of the events of distant times past. Sometimes that's possible, sometimes it's not. Just because you desperately want it, though, that doesn't mean that you're going to get it. There's an old saying, often called the Sagan Standard, which effectively goes, the more extraordinary the claims, the more extraordinary the evidence needs to be. We're not going to doubt a claim that says that at some point in the past, Abraham Lincoln took a shit. That's not an extraordinary claim. Everybody does that. But if there was a claim that on a specific date, Abraham Lincoln whipped off his suit and stovepipe hat and was wearing superhero tights underneath, and he just flew off to the front lines and defeated the Confederacy single-handedly, that would require a ton of evidence to support it. And it doesn't matter how emotionally comforting that claim might be to you. That doesn't change the historical requirements. It's either true or it's not, and your feelings don't remotely enter into it. Keep that in mind as we move forward, because I think it's going to matter.
So if you're going to be a logical person and say that we can't trust any historical facts about Jesus, then it means you can't trust any of history at all.
But we're not saying that. This whole argument is a complete straw man. We are saying that your source material is not sufficient to reach the conclusions that you emotionally want to reach, which is really why this guy sounds so emotional and impassioned in his argument. I don't care about his passion, though. I only care if the claim on the table is rationally and evidentially defensible as it is or not. And whether the religious like it or not, the Bible simply doesn't provide. Now, for just about any other claim in history, they just shrug their shoulders and go on with their lives. But for this one, they can't, because a lot of them have formed their entire self-identity around this specific claim being correct. And they don't all believe the same thing, if you notice. If you ask one group of Christians what they think about the historical life of Jesus, you will get a different story from that other group of Christians over there. And a third tale from the group way over there. Because this isn't about truth. It's 100% about emotional comfort. They want it to be true. They want their own specific versions of it to be true, whether any of it actually is or not. This is not something they are capable of being dispassionate about. They absolutely need the historical record to turn out in their favor, whether it actually does or not. And that's why they have so many problems seeing this rationally.
Because the same arguments you use against Jesus can be used for anything. For example, I can say that George Washington never existed.
Except we have multiple, demonstrably independent eyewitness accounts that he did. We have things that he wrote in his own hand. We have paintings that artists painted while sitting right in front of him. There is no question that George Washington meets all of the criteria for historical existence. Now keep in mind, we're not claiming that George Washington was a supernatural being. If they were, then we'd need a whole lot more proof than what we have. But that is what they're claiming about Jesus. If the Christians were just saying that he was a guy who preached in Palestine 2,000 years ago, okay, I'm happy to say that if that's your claim, I can accept that because it's not a controversial claim that preachers lived 2,000 years ago. However, that's not what they're saying. That's not the claim that they're making. They aren't satisfied with a Jewish rabbi wandering around the Middle East. They insist it had to be some magical man god sent to take away the sins of mankind. That is a controversial claim, and therefore it requires a lot of evidence. And they have none. None whatsoever. In the reality that we live in, they have to offer more proof to back it up, and they can't do that. They simply can't.
And now you might argue by bringing up eyewitness accounts and historical records which prove that he actually existed. And guess what? That's the same thing for Jesus. If you say that Jesus never existed, I can also bring up eyewitness accounts to back me up.
Except there are none. We know that the Gospels were written anonymously, and the names associated with them were only attached many, many years later by the early church, who, at that point in time, had a vested interest in pushing a specific narrative, just like they do today. Money and power are great motivators for telling a lie. But most Christians know nothing of this because they are absurdly ignorant. They know only what they're told on Sunday morning from the pulpit, from a preacher who likewise has a vested interest in pushing a narrative so they get paid for effectively doing nothing useful. So they don't read up on the scholarship. They don't know that most of the archaeological sites claimed to be in the Bible turn out, in retrospect, to be something completely different. Because the religious are great at claiming victory, not so good at revising their proclamations when they turn out to be wrong down the line. Because, honesty isn't really a big thing with the religious. It's kind of funny how that works.
And I'll be talking about those eyewitness testimonies in part 2, so please go check that out.
I think it's pretty clear that he's going to get it all completely wrong, just based on what he said in this video. But maybe I will. I don't know. I want to give him a fair chance, at least to either prove he knows what he's doing, which I think we'll all agree isn't likely, or that he's a complete wingnut that has no idea what the hell he's talking about. My magic 8-ball says signs point to the latter. But let's be honest, religion is all about emotional ignorance, not educated fact. I made this point a while back about psychiatrists not wanting to say that the religious are nuts because it would harm their ability to make money from their practice, and I think the same thing is true of a lot of historians as well. Now, granted, a lot of them, they do drink the religious Kool-Aid and have the same kind of emotional commitment to this specific interpretation of the scant data that the rabid theists do. But a lot of historians operate on grants or they work in universities, and they know that if you make too many waves, then your funding is in jeopardy. Therefore, there aren't a lot who are going to say, nope, that just doesn't fit the data when it comes to popular emotional beliefs. It's hard to tell your meal ticket that they're wrong, especially when they're likely to have a strong negative reaction, not only to your report, but to your continued existence, either as an employee or at all. Let's be honest, a lot of them don't like so-called heretics, and some of them are willing to kill your ass. There are some, of course, like Richard Carrier, David Fitzgerald, Bart Ehrman, and some others, who are perfectly willing to say the truth, though. In fact, if you look at the rank Raglan mythotype, which lists 22 traits common to mythological god beings across various cultures, Jesus fits 20 of the 22. In fact, no other mythical demigod fits that many. It's kind of telling, isn't it? Jesus, at least the Jesus described in the Bible, clearly never existed. Whether there was a man or not, we may never know, but the historical evidence simply doesn't support it. It would be a guess based on emotion with no way to back up any of the details objectively. But the religious don't care about that, do they? It's far too easy to mischaracterize the facts and ignorantly proclaim nonsense because the audience they're making it for, they're predisposed to simply believe and not ask any questions. But that doesn't make any of these claims factually correct, and that's what they need to do. Prove that what they believe is actually true in the real world. And they can't do that. They don't even try. And that's just sad. How can the religious get things so obviously wrong all the time? That's the question I asked today as we dive into part 2 of proving Jesus existed yet doing nothing remotely of the sort. And this is a cautionary tale for the religious to actually do some research into the things that you claim before you make a complete fool of yourself. Because this is really, really common. So let's get into it. It constantly amazes me just how ignorant the religious actually are about, well, everything. They constantly make claims that are easily proven false, such that there's no way in the world that they could not know that they were false unless they were actively avoiding researching the subject. Which I think a lot of them are. This isn't about facts, this is about feelings, and the religious are just dumb enough not to give a crap whether what they believe is actually true or not. So here we go again with yet another clear and obvious example of just that. Strap in, here we go with part 2 of proving Jesus existed. Now, before we get started, I did go back and look at this channel, and they have lots and lots of lists of things that supposedly prove Christianity. Although, let's be honest, after seeing the first video on the existence of Jesus, this is really pretty pedestrian stuff, and the presentation is uniformly awful. This stuff is meant to be viewed on a cell phone, and Speedy Gonzalez here doesn't sound like he's well versed in making videos at all. So I'm going to leave this up to my viewing audience whether or not they want me to pursue any more of this. I'm only doing this video because in the last, he mentioned eyewitness testimony of Jesus in passing, and I didn't feel I could just walk away without addressing it. But let me know if you'd like me to go on and continue doing this series, or maybe jump on to others like the resurrection. So, with that out of the way, let's get cracking.
Part 2 of proving Jesus existed. In part 1 I talked about how exactly I'd be proving Jesus existed, and I brought the topic of eyewitness testimonies, which is what I'll be talking about in this video.
It'll be interesting to see what he comes up with, since we have absolutely no demonstrable eyewitness testimony to Jesus whatsoever. None. Zero. Zip. Zilch. There aren't any. And this is something that messes up a lot of theists. We don't have any accounts where the author says, I personally saw Jesus do X. At least not reliably or verifiably. All of the ones outside of the Bible, and we'll get to that later, but every single extra-biblical account is told by people who weren't alive during the supposed time of Jesus and are just relating stories that they heard from believers. That's not testimony at all, much less eyewitness testimony. That's just hearsay. None of these people actually saw Jesus. They just heard stories about him like a giant game of telephone. And that's actually a very accurate analogy. You have to remember that back in those days, virtually everyone was illiterate. They couldn't read and they couldn't write. They relied on a very, very small number of people to read to them out of the very few stories and accounts that were there. Which is why the early church was set up the way that it was. You had a bunch of people who couldn't read, sitting around, listening to one guy in the front who could. That's why these stories weren't written down for decades, and in that time, there were variations. But let's get back to our fast-talking theist.
So the main eyewitness accounts we have are from the disciples and apostles, who were the closest people to Jesus on earth.
Except we don't. We know that the Gospels were written anonymously, and it was only later, many, many years later, that the church attached names to them in keeping with church tradition. We have no idea, none whatsoever, who actually wrote the Gospels, and we have a lot of really good reasons to doubt that they were written by the people whose names eventually ended up on them. Even Bible scholars agree with this. In the overview of the New Testament, the Oxford Annotated Bible states, Neither the evangelists nor their first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith, as in Luke 1:4, John 20:31, etc. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. So we already know that the Bible was not written to present the facts in the Jesus narrative. It was intended to tell a story to convince a generally ignorant audience to follow their beliefs. That doesn't make any of it factually correct. So we can go back into the text itself and find that the narratives are internally anonymous. Absolutely none of the Gospels named the authors within them. Now, that was not common in the time. Many other sources actively name their author, including books written by Thucydides, Josephus, and Herodotus, among others. And of course, this goes for many other books in the New Testament, like some of the books attributed to John, and some traditionally claimed to have been written by Paul. Books like Hebrews, nobody actually knows. It is important to point out here that even many apologists have been forced to acknowledge this simple fact. Craig Blomberg, who states in Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ on page 22, it's important to acknowledge that, strictly speaking, the Gospels are anonymous. Yeah, strictly speaking, called It's a Fact. So these are not eyewitness accounts by any means. These are stories, the validity of which we simply cannot verify. The religious would like them to be true, but they cannot demonstrate them to be true. And that's a very important distinction.
And these people documented the life of Jesus in the 4 books we know today as the Gospels. There are also non-biblical sources as well from the Jewish historian Josephus.
Let's stop you right there, because Josephus, by definition, could not have been an eyewitness account because he could not have been born until after the supposed death of Jesus. Even at the most charitable, Jesus might have died as late as 33 CE, although it was more likely somewhere between 25 and 27 CE. Josephus wasn't even born until 37 CE, thus he couldn't possibly have been an eyewitness. He simply wasn't around. Now, I'm sure we'll see this time and time again because all of the classically named external sources that the religious tend to come up with, they were all born far too late to have ever seen Jesus alive. And you'd think this would bother the religious because it should. But they don't care. They're either ignorant, and there's no excuse for that with the internet around, or they're just plain dumb. Take your pick. Now, in the case of Josephus, the passage in question simply doesn't exist in the earliest versions of his Jewish antiquities. It was a clear case of early Christian forgery, of which there are many other examples. Josephus never wrote it, and that passage in particular, the one that mentions Jesus, is written in a completely different voice than the passages preceding and following it in the text. If you remove it entirely, the passages hang together very well. That part, the part that was obviously a forgery, has very glaring textual differences. So it's all just a few false passages placed by delusional Christians in a desperate attempt to validate their beliefs. Honestly, what else is new?
And the Roman historian Tacitus,
who also wasn't born until after the supposed era of Jesus. Tacitus wasn't born until 56 CE, thus, once again, not an eyewitness. Now, it's possible that Tacitus wrote the account that the Christians are talking about, which appears in Annals, Book 15, Chapter 44, but clearly it was never intended to talk about Jesus, only early Christians. That part only comes in passing. It comes directly after a passage describing the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE and describes the persecution of Christians, not Jesus, Christians who were being blamed by some because blaming Nero was politically inconvenient, especially since Nero himself had targeted the Christians as a distraction. Now, keep in mind that Tacitus calls the leader of the Christians Chrestus, not Jesus, and then says that this Chrestus was put to death by Pontius Pilate. Certainly that follows the traditional Christian narrative, but we have to ask ourselves where he got that information. Did Tacitus do independent research and look up what might have been, at the time, existing Roman records? Or did he just ask the Christians what happened and wrote down whatever they said? The latter is far, far more likely. Tacitus is not known to be a terribly well-researched author. But keep in mind that we lack the original manuscript. Annals has been lost to history and is only known through two remaining copies known as the Medicean manuscripts. So we don't know what he actually wrote, and we have to rely on some anonymous Middle Ages scribe to tell us what was in there. Regardless, Tacitus never saw Jesus, and thus he cannot be considered to be an eyewitness account.
And keep in mind that the early Jews and Romans were the worst enemies of Jesus, but even they didn't say that Jesus never existed.
They didn't actually mention Jesus at all, at least not in official records. Keep in mind that the Romans were meticulous record keepers, so if Pilate really put Jesus to death, it would have been recorded somewhere. These things didn't just happen on a whim. Now, it's certainly possible that these records have been lost over the centuries. These things certainly do happen. But the Christians have to explain why these records don't exist, because they have nothing that they can actually point to. The records are gone. How do they know this crap is real, except within their religious stories? They pretend that there is all of this evidence, but when you actually sit down and look at it, there's really nothing there to examine. And this it should be, a problem for the religious, except, as I keep saying, they just don't care. They really don't. Your typical Christian on the street, they just don't give a damn. If the apologists say that these records exist, then, for all intents and purposes, these records exist, whether they actually do or not. They're not going to go and do any research on their own, as it's painfully clear that our fast-talking friend here didn't. It fits their narrative, they want to believe it, therefore, it's got to be true. Except reality doesn't really work that way.
You can read a lot of Tacitus writings about Jesus in the works Annals and Histories,
which, as I already said, we don't actually have original manuscripts of anymore. That means we need to trust scribes from the Middle Ages, religious scribes from the Middle Ages, to have accurately copied these passages. Can we? I don't know, and neither do you.
What's interesting about Tacitus is that he talks about Jesus and his followers in a very derogatory way, but he still acknowledges that he was a real person, because it would just been stupid to say Jesus never existed.
Nobody denies the existence of Christians. It's the validity of his claims about Jesus, or Christus, or whatever you want to say, that matter, and at the center of that inquiry is where did he get his information? The most likely answer is that he just asked Christians and recorded their stories. And that doesn't necessarily make them true. Tacitus had no way to verify any of this. It's why the passage means absolutely nothing.
You can even read Lucian's work and see that he makes fun of Christians for worshipping Jesus as he was crucified.
Lucian of Samosata was born in 125 CE, thus not an eyewitness. The passage in question was written around 170 CE, recounting the words of a speaker in a town square after a man named Proteus had thrown himself into a fire. So it wasn't even Lucian speaking here. It was an unverified tale by someone who also couldn't have been an eyewitness of Jesus. Lucian doesn't even mention Jesus by name, calling him the Christian first lawgiver. This is just more telling of tall tales, something that Lucian was well known for. He even wrote A True Story, which was a satire of imaginary stories that included space travel, aliens, and an interstellar war. I think we have sufficient reason to doubt that this account proves anything about any real Jesus. It's all kind of silly when you think about it, but Christians are desperate and they'll go to almost any lengths.
So we know there is non-biblical and biblical eyewitness testimonies.
And I've just proven that absolutely none of them were eyewitness testimonies. This guy doesn't even know what the hell those words mean. An eyewitness is someone who sees something with their own eyes. They have to be physically present at the event, and none of these could have been. And this is exactly why we have to spend so much time digging through the religious mire to find out what the hell they're doing. Because what they're doing isn't honest. Ever. I think we can safely say ever. Because this is really the level of scholarship that we see from most Christian apologists. They desperately want to believe, so they find something that can, if you look at it just right and ignore reality, be interpreted as support for their faith. Yet when you dig deeper, it's clear that it does absolutely nothing of the sort. And this guy has no excuse. He could have looked up when Lucian or Tacitus or Josephus lived and realized that none of them could have been eyewitnesses. In fact, at least in the case of Lucian, absolutely no one still alive at the time could have been an eyewitness. It was 140 years at the very least after the supposed crucifixion of Jesus. This in a time where the average lifespan was 66 years. But hey, that's inconvenient, so clearly the religious just ignore it.
But what if these accounts are made up? I'll explain that in part 3, so make sure to go check that out.
I honestly don't know that it's worth my time to go through this guy's crap because obviously he's been absurdly wrong in pretty much every word that's come out of his mouth at 1,000,000 miles an hour, at least when you can understand what he's saying. But let's be honest, this is the same kind of crap that most apologists go with, and if I can completely debunk every single bit of it with 5 minutes on Google, then there is something really wrong with these people. It's like they don't care. Because they don't. This is why historians care so much about having multiple, independent, demonstrably eyewitness accounts to determine what actually happened in the past. And the Christians have absolutely none of that. There isn't a single account that can be proven to have been written by an actual eyewitness. Not one. And in fact, all of the claimed eyewitness accounts out there, as we've just seen, we can prove they weren't actually eyewitnesses. How exactly does that work? Because these people simply aren't concerned. We can look at these and find out that's false. And there are others we could look at as well, like Pliny the Younger, or Suetonius, or Thallus, or Phlegon. But none of them fare any better. For both Thallus and Phlegon, none of their works survive to this day, and we have to rely on later, almost entirely Christian sources making claims about what they might have said without actually being able to prove that any of it actually happened. And they weren't eyewitnesses either. But you know who would have been eyewitnesses? People like Seneca and Paterculus and Philo and Pliny the Elder, among many, many others, all of whom lived at the same time and in the same area as Jesus supposedly did, and most certainly would have taken notice of someone rising from the dead. Yet none of them ever did. Imagine that. This whole thing falls apart the second you give it more than a passing glance, which is why the religious never do that. They can't, because they don't care, and that's where all the problems come from. Maybe, just maybe they ought to care, because maybe if they did, they wouldn't hold such obviously absurd beliefs. And wouldn't that be nice?